Okay. My name is Lee Taylor, and I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Just adjusting my screen. Our session today is in Zoom webinar. That means all attendees are muted and your videos are off. We are recording the session and it will be available soon. I'll drop the link in the chat box here in a moment. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for all questions. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. American Sign Language interpreters will be on screen throughout the session. You may change your view at the top portion of your screen. You can set it to gallery view and you'll be able to see Miriam and the ASL interpreters. We know that there may be some technical difficulties and we appreciate your patience as we encounter any today. If you are interested in continuing education credits or certificates of attendance, this slide is for you. You must be in the content portion of the webinar for at least 90% of the session to be eligible for a certificate. This is a mandate by the boards. Please do not leave the webinar until the conclusion of the Q&A, as that counts as part of the content session. You do not have to enter your contact information in the chat. However, you can if you would like to. All attendees and their time is tracked by Zoom. You must use the same email address to log in as you used to register. And that can be as simple as clicking the link that was sent to the email that you used to register. Don't worry if you're on your phone. As long as you click that link, you'll be good. And also, just a side note, if you receive the link from a friend or coworker, we will not be able to track your attendance and you will not be eligible for a certificate. Okay. So around the first week of December, you'll receive an email from me that will provide a link to access the session evaluation, then your certificate. This is a screenshot to show you the landing page for the evaluations and certificates. You must complete the session evaluation in order to proceed to the certificate. And lastly, you are responsible for printing your certificate. We do not mail or email certificates anymore. This website houses several years of the SOC Academy. So if you lose your certificate, you can access the website to print another at any time. Now let's learn about our presenter. Miriam Silman is the Trauma and Resilience Advisor at the Kentucky Department for Behavioral Health, Developmental, and Intellectual Disabilities, working to create a trauma-informed, resilience-oriented system of care, system of service delivery, and workforce support across the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. Miriam also serves as the co-director for Kentucky Project Aware, promoting student mental health and wellness through implementation and sustainability of school-based behavioral health supports. She has worked as a clinician, researcher, and trainer focusing on trauma and resilience across various populations, professionals, and service sectors for more than 30 years, including at Mountain Comprehensive Care Center, the University of Kentucky Department of Psychiatry, and the University of Kentucky Center on Trauma in Children. Recently, she has focused her work on supporting organizations to implementing trauma-informed and resilience-building strategies to enhance service outcomes and mitigate the impact of secondary trauma exposure on human service workers, particularly healthcare, behavioral health, education, and global health providers. She has also worked to develop, implement, and evaluate a number of behavioral health, public health, and arts programs across Eastern Kentucky. Miriam has a BA from Brown University, an MSW from the University of Kentucky, and completed her doctoral coursework in social work at the University of Kentucky. She's published in peer-reviewed journals and presented at national conferences. She currently lives in Lexington, Kentucky, and enjoys hiking, reading, playing the piano, and travel. Welcome, Miriam.
Thanks, Lee. We clearly need to shorten that and adjust it. I thought it was for written. I think that's the one I use when it gets printed in a program, but We appreciate it. And my apologies, my mouse was right over the record thing and I hit it and it paused it for a moment, but we caught that. So nice to have everybody here. And we will go ahead and get started. Clearly, I have hosting abilities since I was able to pause the recording. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and remind everybody that if you have questions, and hang on, let me make sure I'm sharing for sound also. All right. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A box for questions and the chat for some comments. If you find the chat distracting while I'm talking, please feel free to turn that off so that you don't get, as many of the notifications. So I'm just trying to see how I can actually, I don't know why I'm not seeing myself at all, but I assume that somebody would tell me if you're not seeing the screen.
So Miriam, at the top right-hand portion of your screen, change the view to side-by-side gallery.
Yeah, I had it on side-by-side gallery and the whole thing disappeared.
I can see you.
Okay, as long as you guys can see me, it's just a little bit odd for me to, anyway, it's fine. It's fine. We're just going to keep going. So, okay. As long as it's recording in that way. All right, so this is Carrying Care, Strategies for Building Resilience in the System of Care Workforce. And we're basically going to try to do two big things today, is talk about what we mean by resilience in the workforce, in the workplace, and what threatens workforce well-being and resilience for child and family serving staff and health and human service and education providers. And then we'll dig into some strategies. So I hope we'll also have opportunity to try some strategies. So we are together for until 3 o'clock. I'll try to end a few minutes early so we have time for questions. Those of you who know me know that sometimes I get started talking, but I'm trying to get better at watching the time in that way. I think it's really important when we are talking about trauma and resilience to make sure that we pay attention to how we're feeling. And one of the things that we know is that very often we are good at doing the work in real time and being right there and rising to the occasion and being with our customers and our clients and our constituents. And that then sometimes when we get away from it, it washes over us. And often that happens when we are in trainings and people are talking about things. And all of a sudden we have a moment to pause and reflect and kind of feel the heaviness and the impact of the work that we do day in and day out. So I urge you to just stay connected to yourself and pay attention to what's going on in your body, in your brain, in your heart, in your gut. And that can guide you to know how you need to take care of yourself, both in the moment. Do you need to take a pause? Do you need to get up and stretch? But also later on, sometimes what happens is we start thinking about something in a training or a conversation or in something that happens during the day and it stays with us. And I think we've all had that experience. One of the things that we know, and we'll talk more about this later, but one of the things that we know is that some of the things that we typically think about when we think about self-care often make us feel better in the moment, but aren't necessarily geared towards helping us process and metabolize what we're feeling or thinking and how the work is affecting us. And so we encourage you to find space where you can do that processing, whether it's with yourself or with somebody else who you trust, and whether that's talking or journaling or getting out what you're feeling and thinking, sorting through it in some way that actually addresses it as opposed to just pushes it away or ignores it. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But this is a slide that I use always at the beginning of every training that I do, because I do think it's important. And I like to make that distinction between self-awareness and self-care. And what I'm asking you to do is to be very self-aware in this moment. I also like when I come to the System of Care Academy, which I love and have had the privilege of coming to for a number of years now, is to ground us in remembering what that system of care is. And, it's a spectrum, and it's a lot of different kinds of services and supports for children and youth and transition age youth, for those kids and their families, and that we are coordinated, we work together, we're collaborative, and we also build those very, very strong and important partnerships with families and youth. We are culturally responsive, we are culturally humble, and we are looking at helping folks to feel good and reach their human potential at home, in school, in the community, at work, and throughout the lifespan. And that's a pretty big charge. And it's a really lofty one, and it's really, really important. I mean, we're talking about, almost life and death, like how people really function in the day-to-day and for the long term. And so the work that we do, I just want to remind you that the work that we all do really matters. This is really, really important. And so it's really critical that we attend to ourselves so that we can continue to sustain ourselves and one another to do this very important, critical work. And so we can't think about achieving this goal without also thinking about, in my mind, without also thinking about how we do it and how we take care of ourselves to do it. So we're going to start at the beginning. Many of you probably are familiar with this, but I always like to ground us in remembering what we mean by trauma, because trauma is one of those words that gets very overused sometimes, and I think misapplied. Not everything is a trauma. Lots of things can be adversities, but not everything is a trauma. And it's important to make that distinction in our own minds and to help others make that distinction as well. We use the 3E definition of trauma that comes from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And the 3 E's are event, experience, and effect. When we talk about trauma as an event, we have a very specific definition. A traumatic event is one that conveys actual or perceived threat, and that threat can be a threat of death, of serious injury, or of sexual violation. And that threat can either be to oneself or to somebody who one cares about closely. So this helps us to understand that we can't necessarily determine what is a traumatic event objectively, because some things seem to be life-threatening, but other things might not be life-threatening or cause a threat of serious injury, in my mind, for myself, but it might for you, or for yourself, or for somebody who you're close to. And so there's a little bit of flexibility here in that very important element of perceived threat. And this is what helps us to understand that the same events can be experienced differently by different people, which brings us to that second E of experience. And what we know about experiencing a traumatic event is that experience, even if people agree that the event was traumatic, the experience is going to be very different for different people. It's a very unique response that we each have, because it has to do with partially how we're wired, our kind of I just lost the word, our temperaments, but also it has a lot to do with our experience and what we've been exposed to and experienced so far in our life. The event and the experience then create the effect. And what we know about the effects of trauma is that they vary tremendously. We also know that the effects of trauma are very often adverse, and that they can be long-lasting, and that they can have a global reach. And what I mean by that is that they can affect different areas of our functioning. So our social, our emotional, our cognitive and thinking, our cognition and thinking, our spiritual sense, and even our physical development and functioning and well-being, and our medical status. So what we know is that for some people, the impact of trauma is going to be pretty short term, and they kind of rebound and get back to life as usual. For others, it may have a much more long-lasting impact. And again, that has so much to do with how we experience the event to start with, and how it impacts us. We also know that effects can come and go over the course of time. And so things can feel like they're getting better, and then something can bring it back up. I just had a meeting this morning with some folks talking about the anniversary of the tornadoes in Western Kentucky last year and how that might be affecting people in those communities that were most significantly impacted. So we know that sometimes people can feel like, oh, wow, I feel so much better than I did right after this happened or in the first few months. And then as we get closer to this anniversary date, they may feel out of sorts and not really connect that's what it is. But very often that is what it is. There are lots of different types of trauma, and we want you to remember that the folks who you're working with in the system of care have likely experienced several things, right? So it's rare that people have only had one adversity, and so many of these things may rise to the level of trauma for them. But we want to also remember that all of these different things can load onto those experiences and create those lasting effects in certain ways. So as you can see from this list, we have things that happen within families, interpersonal kinds of adversities and traumas and violence. We have things like neglect, which would be different from abuse. And then we have things that happen in communities, community violence, natural disaster. We also have things that are man-made, things like racism or microaggressions or war or human trafficking. We also have things that our system sometimes creates, like separating families. So there's lots of different ways that we experience trauma, and it can be bigger or smaller, but these all add up. And it's important when you are working with a family to really look carefully at the range of trauma exposures that they may have experienced to understand what those effects might be. What we know about trauma is that when we do experience trauma, we are hardwired to have a response, that fight, flight, or freeze response. And this is part of our constitution as human beings. This is actually part of how we have survived. It's part of evolution. If we didn't have this, we probably would have been eaten by some kind of animal somewhere much earlier in our evolutionary chain. And one of the things that's really interesting is that despite evolution and despite the advances that and the changes that have happened in our brains over the millennia, this very basic survival instinct has stayed pretty much the same. And when you drill down to all of the symptoms and signs that we see when we've experienced trauma, if you keep drilling back, you can usually eventually get back to one of these three responses that is driving the behaviors that we see. So when you see kids in schools, for example, who seem very agitated, very often it's because they are having a flight response. They are feeling stressed or threatened by something, and it may be real or it may be perceived, and their instinct is to get out of here. And one of the ways that they quote unquote get out of here is by moving around, but they can't leave the classroom. Sometimes they do, but they're not supposed to, so they get very agitated. Another kind of flight might be in spacing out. That's another way that we often flee a situation and avoid it. And being irritable is kind of a small dose of our fight response. So we really manifest this in lots of different ways. I want to share a quick video with you about how chronic stress impacts our brain, because it really does have a powerful effect on our brains. And then we'll think about what this means for us at work. Lee, if you don't hear the sound in just a minute, make sure that somebody lets me know.
Perfect.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed?
I'm sorry, I seem not to have embedded this with the captions, and I'm not sure that I can do that right away. Does anybody know if I can do it while it's already embedded?
Press play anyway, Miriam, because I have the auto transcription said on the bottom of this.
Okay, great.
So
Thank
that
you so
should
much.
catch it.
Sorry,
That's okay.
I think I lifted these slides and they didn't have it.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
So I do want to say that last bit, I probably should cut it off before that last bit, a little bit of, wishful thinking. It's sometimes easier said than done. But one of the things that I want us to really think about is that all of this trauma that may have been experienced by the folks who we help, we also may have experienced some of those traumas ourselves. And what does that do? That's the kind of stress that is that extreme end of the stress continuum, right? So when we think about what that clip tells us about how stress, and especially extreme stress or traumatic stress, can impact our brain and body, it gives us pause. I really like this diagram because it represents what the two, ends of the spectrum between when we are not experiencing stress on the left, where we have lots of brain energy for thinking and for our social emotional well-being and interactions, and our regulation of our bodies and our emotions kind of happens naturally. We don't have to devote a ton of energy to it. We're pretty well regulated, and we're not thinking about our survival. We're able to assume that our survival is okay. But when we are under a lot of stress, extreme traumatic stress, we look more like the triangle on the right, where our energy has to be focused on survival and much more on regulating our body, but much less is available for things like thinking and our social and emotional cognition. Now we move in the middle there, right? These are the two extremes. But I think this is a really helpful diagram to remember, because when we ourselves are stressed, we can think about, oh gosh, no wonder it's taking longer for me to do my work or get this particular task done, or I'm having trouble making a decision, because literally our brain is not functioning in that executive functioning, that area of cognition quite as well. This is a really helpful thing for us to remember as well when we're dealing with our colleagues, right? And with folks who we are helping and working with and interacting with on a daily basis in our work. So that sometimes when people are irritable or short-tempered, or they are having trouble remembering things, or they're not doing all of the things that we've asked them to do between appointments or contacts, it may not be because they don't want to or they're resistant, but it may be because it's too much for them at this time, and we have to break it down or spread it out a little bit more. But also for ourselves, extending that grace and understanding for ourselves and for our colleagues is an important first step. So this is kind of the frame to help us understand what's happening when we get stressed and how we might think about it. Now, we know that lots of people experience adversity, and there's a lot of trauma in this world. And we know that humans are remarkably resilient. And resilience is also one of those words, like trauma, that is used a lot and sometimes not always used well. One of the problems with resilience is we actually haven't landed on a definition that everybody agrees on and that we think is the best way to describe it. So these are some of the most common ways that we think about resilience, this idea of adapting well, bouncing back or bouncing forward. We know that resilience requires things like flexibility and the ability to adapt, and we have to be pretty persistent to get through sometimes and have a certain amount of grit. We also understand that resilience is not just in individuals, but it can be in families, in communities, and systems, and organizations even, and that there can be varying levels of resilience. And like the effects of trauma, resilience can wax and wane. It can come and go. There are times where we are more resilient. There are times when we are less resilient, even about the same kinds of things. There may even be parts of our life where we are able to be pretty resilient and other parts where we're not. So maybe we feel pretty resilient and strong in our work settings, but less so at home and with loved ones, or maybe the other way around. We see this with kids a lot, but we need to think about this for ourselves, in that sometimes we can be pretty tough and resilient while we're doing our jobs in our workplace, but we feel less strong when we're at home. And that's when things kind of wash over us. And it's important to pay attention to both, because if we're not feeling as resilient in one part of our life, it may not necessarily be related to that part. It may be a kind of bleeding out from another part. But I'm not convinced that any of these really get at the full complexity of resilience. So I share them with you also with a caution of taking them too literally or limiting. I really like these three ways of describing resilience, and they're kind of different. So that speaks to the fact that resilience probably is, we're trying to use one term for a lot of different things. Resmaa Menakem, who wrote a beautiful book called My Grandmother's Hands, talks about resilience as a flow. which I think is a really beautiful way to think about it. And like most things that flow, it really gets at the idea that it's dynamic and changing, and can be stronger or weaker or deeper or more shallow at different times. And that this idea that the flow is about some social interaction. So it's not just about the flow within ourselves, but between us and others, and that can influence it. And that really speaks to the idea that we as a community, whether it's a work community or a community at large, are responsible for helping one another to be resilient and to build resilience. Anne Maston, who's the kind of the mother of all things resilience in children, she's been doing this work for probably 50 years at this point, talks about the idea of that resilience in children is distributed in their relationships. And I think that that's a really helpful thing for us to remember, because if how we build resilience is distributed, then probably how we maintain it as adults is also somewhat distributed. And I love this last one, Thomas Hubel, who is leading some really interesting work around how we as a community, as a global community, in fact, build our resilience so that we can be more resilient individually as well as collectively. Describes resilience in this way: resilience is my ability to stay related to my challenges. And what I like about this is because this reminds us that being resilient actually involves leaning into and understanding what it is that is challenging for us, that is causing us the stress, and not just running away from it or trying to say, oh, I'll deal with that another day. But resilience is really about embracing it and accepting it and kind of going through it. Many of you may remember that children's book, Going on a Bear Hunt. And I always think of that image from that book of, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it, you have to go through it. And I think that that really speaks to the idea that we can't separate resilience from the adversity that is requiring us to have to be resilient, and they're connected, and we do have to lean in. This last way of describing resilience is really one that I think is so important for us to remember. So Michael Unger, who has his work has guided the work around global resilience through the World Health Organization and UNICEF and some other big organizations, talks about resilience being both our capacity to navigate resources and the condition that we find ourselves in where these resources are available and accessible to us. And I think that's so important, because we never want to blame people for not being resilient if they don't have access to the supports that could help them be resilient. And so that speaks to how we think about the work that we do, but also how we think about how we do our work, right? And so this gets at the idea that if the work that we do is stressful, it's probably not a good enough answer to say to people, well, you should rest more at home, or you should take more bubble baths, or you should exercise more, or whatever. Those things may be important, but they in and of themselves may not be enough to build that workforce resilience. We may have to think about, what are we as an organization, as a community, a system of care doing to provide the resources to help people be as resilient as the most resilient workers they can be. All right, so some food for thought around resilience. Oh, there's something missing on this screen, which is kind of weird. Maybe it's in white and it's outside of it. And oops, sorry. But oh, there it is. See? Okay, we're having a few technology gremlins today. Resilience is important because it helps us to navigate the ups and downs, the challenges, to be accountable and responsible, and it is a part of our overall well-being. So this is why it matters for us to be as resilient as we can be as workers, because these things are all really important qualities to have in our role as system of care workers. All right, so what do we know about how people build resilience? Well, this is kind of the way that the American Psychological Association has thought about it. And of course, that's primarily looking at it as an individual activity and an individual characteristic. But I think that this is a nice frame that can be extended. So we see these 4 buckets. Connections matter. And I think we've all really learned that, and we've heard that over the last few years. We saw how connections needed to change when we had to move into a place of social distancing, of physical distancing. Excuse me, and we tried to use that terminology, physical distancing rather than social distancing, because part of what the challenge was how do we maintain those social connections and connectedness in that way? And so we have lots of ways that we build those connections, as you can see on the screen. We also know that wellness is a part of resilience. And so wellness helps build resilience. Resilience contributes to our overall sense of well-being. And that kind of makes sense because we know that having healthy bodies and healthy minds helps to promote our sense of well-being. So when we think about wellness, we think about it in the broadest sense: care for the body, care for the mind, and not only building up those positives, but avoiding the negative things that can be it can take away from our wellness in our body and our mind. And sometimes those negative outlets are things that give us immediate relief, right? But they're not so good for the long term. So, like I'm a chocolate junkie. And so if I'm super stressed or super tired, I can be chowing down on the chocolate, which of course makes me feel horrible later. And I have a terrible sugar crash. And I just don't feel good. So there's all kinds of things that we tend to grab that over the long term aren't necessarily helpful for our wellness, and in that way, not so helpful for our resilience also. This third one of healthy thinking is one that sometimes people who are not in behavioral health or in human services say, yeah, I don't know. And it turns out that actually there's very, very good evidence now from the field of positive psychology that healthy thinking and positive thinking and things like being able to create a sense of gratitude and have future goals and have a sense of optimism and learning how to be optimistic, which is something that we can learn, are very, very helpful in helping us to weather life's challenges and be resilient. And then this last bucket of meaning making is probably the one that we have started to understand most recently. And it turns out that part of what gets us through the tough times is having a deeper sense that we matter in the world, that we make a difference, that we can help others, that others can help us, that what we do impacts others and our own lives and can contribute to the larger good. And it turns out that this is important for us as adults, but it's also important for kids. But this is a really big part of what helps us to get through challenges in our workplace, is feeling like the work that we do, who we are, the way we do it, our role matters, and that it does help others, and others are counting on us, and that we are contributing in this larger way. So all of this speaks to the idea that in order to build resilience, in order to mitigate the impact of trauma, we really are talking about recognizing our shared humanity. And I love this quote from Desmond Tutu that, my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. And I would submit that our resilience is also bound up in one another's, and that we are more resilient when we are resilient together in that way. So I want you to bear that in mind as we start to talk about how we combat these threats to resilience in work. The work that we do has a lot of things that can eat away at our resilience as professionals. And you see many of them here on the screen. So the ones that are connected: compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization, grief and loss, and moral distress, all are things that happen when we are doing work that is connected to trauma. Burnout is something that we can all experience, but it isn't limited to people who do work with trauma or with human beings. Burnout can happen to anybody in any kind of role. It definitely does happen to health and human services workers, and we may even be at high risk for it. But so we're going to talk about burnout, but we're really going to talk about these other threats to our well-being and then look at strategies. And the good news is that the strategies for some of these other threats are also good strategies to prevent and to mitigate the impact of burnout. So let's start with this idea of burnout. Burnout's been around now for, 40 plus years as an official concept. But I think that in the way that we think about it, we sometimes don't remember what the original definition of burnout is. And burnout is not just that feeling of exhaustion or being overwhelmed or being sick of what we're doing, but it's when those things get to the point of extinguishing our motivation, of compromising our sense of inspiration and motivation and incentive, right? And that is particularly at risk when we feel like we're working hard, trying hard, but we're not seeing results that we want to see. Now, I'm relatively new to state government. I've been here for a little over 2 years, but I'm not new to the field of being a social worker, being a therapist, working to make the world a better place. And so I really can relate to this because there are times where you feel like you're just working really hard and not getting the desired results. And so I think that we have to recognize that burnout is a risk for all of us. And it does come and go. And there are times when we are at greater risk or feeling it a little bit more, and we kind of move in and out of this state. But what I really, as I said, want to focus on, I want to kind of put a pin in the idea of burnout and now turn our attention to how the work that we do with people who have experienced traumas in their life can impact us. And one of the earliest ways that we recognize this was this concept of compassion fatigue. So in the 1990s, Charles Figley was looking at the world of child welfare, so child protective services in our state. That's the DCBS Protection and Permanency Division. And what we understand and what Figley found from his research, and now we all kind of take for granted, is that there's a cost to this kind of work, a cost to caring. And he started out by looking at child welfare workers, and then he and others started looking at healthcare workers, at mental health providers, substance use providers, advocates, all kinds of people, later on educators, all kinds of people who are in what we consider to be the helping profession, the caregiving role. And what we have come up with is this understanding that over time, when you are in a role that requires a tremendous amount of compassion, you can actually get fatigued from having to constantly give of yourself emotionally, that sense of compassion. And so the National Child Traumatic Stress Network gives us a definition of compassion fatigue as being that emotional duress when we hear about or interface with trauma experiences of others. And as we've started to pay attention to this more, and there's been more research and we've looked at it a little more carefully, we've understood that as we lose our sense of compassion, our ability to be compassionate to others, to those who we're helping, it's not just that we're losing our ability to be compassionate to them, but also we are actually losing a sense of compassion for ourselves. And what it turns out is that self-compassion is critical, because if we don't have a sense of compassion for ourselves, it's almost impossible for us to have a sense of compassion for others. Now, very often that seems counter to what we think are our experiences. We think, oh gosh, I don't take care of myself because I'm so busy taking care of others. But it turns out that taking care of and having compassion for are not exactly one and the same. And so this idea of compassion is this idea that we can understand how another feels, and that we we are in tune with ourselves. And the danger comes when we, for reasons of survival, start to just disengage from tuning into not only others, but also ourselves. And it's very hard to come back from that place. And that's when you see people in the human services who are very cynical and who don't have anything nice to say about anybody, including the people who they're trying to help. And you find yourself wondering, why do these people do this work? Like, why did this person choose this work? You know, we all know it's not for the money. So if they really dislike people so much, why are they doing this? But they didn't start out that way. And the good news is that they don't have to stay that way. I want to just tell you a little bit about vicarious traumatization because it's a term that you may see. It also was established at around the same time as compassion fatigue. And these were two strains of thinking and research that were happening simultaneously. Vicarious traumatization came out of research that was done specifically with mental health providers and therapists who were working with survivors of trauma. And so what Karen Sack-Vitney and Lorianne Perlman found was that it changed the therapist's worldview, their sense of how they interacted with the world, even though they themselves hadn't experienced the trauma necessarily, but just from hearing the traumas of those that they were working with, it caused them to change their sense of what the world was like. Their inner experience was altered in very, very profound ways. So it's similar to compassion fatigue, slightly different. Not important for us to parse all of those differences. These two terms are sometimes used interchangeably. I would argue that they're not exactly the same, but it's okay. So just so that you understand where they came from. The one that we really want to focus on is this idea of secondary traumatic stress. So as we started to recognize that helpers, professional helpers, were being impacted by the trauma of those that they were helping, we started to see that they were developing some of the same kinds of signs and symptoms, if you will, as the people that they were helping. But this didn't really make sense because in order to be diagnosed, for example, with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or acute stress disorder, you actually have to have experienced a trauma. That's the first criteria. And for the helpers, they hadn't experienced it. They were just helping people who had experienced it. So this question came up of, could this be a different kind of traumatic stress response? One where, because we have a high degree of exposure to trauma of others, it still somehow is creating some of these symptoms. So the answer seems to be yes. We have used this concept of secondary traumatic stress for over 20 years now to describe when professional helpers and providers experience signs and symptoms of traumatic stress. So things like avoidance, not wanting to deal with certain things, finding themselves avoiding certain kinds of clients or certain kinds of work, avoiding certain kinds of places or people or experiences. Maybe they've experienced some intrusions where they can't stop thinking about the case or the work or a particular person who they're helping. Maybe they're having nightmares. And they're not only, when they try to stop thinking about it, those thoughts pop back, or they are being activated by reminders in some way. And then once they're thinking about it, they can't stop in that way. Or arousal, where they find themselves a little more sensitive, or maybe a lot more sensitive to certain kinds of things, having fears that they didn't have before that don't make sense for them, but might make sense for the people who they're helping based on the traumas that those people have experienced. So it's a kind of taking on and taking in of these experiences, and that then actually creates similar kinds of symptoms. And we understand that secondary traumatic stress, like compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, may be an inherent risk to the work that we do. It may be that if we are exposed to people who have experienced a lot of trauma, that if we are caring, compassionate people and professionals, then there's no way that we're not going to be impacted and have some degree of that stress response that was described in the video, even though we haven't been we haven't had the primary exposure ourselves. I'm going to share with you this clip from Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky. Laura runs something called the Trauma Stewardship Institute, and this is a clip that describes when she realized she was experiencing some secondary trauma. Sorry, it lost its place where it was queued, but let me pull it up.
Remaining bits that exist in life, we would all be affected by that so differently. I have no doubt that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is, and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, "Hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off." And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not gonna have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted, I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, "Are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you?" And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, oh, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview.
So one of the reasons that I really like that clip is because I think it raises a lot of different things for us to think about. the first is that somehow the nature of the work sometimes makes us feel like we don't have the right to acknowledge its toll on us, right? She starts out that clip by talking about the fact that, like, you know, she had gotten these messages that if you were doing important work to help others, the assumption was you had to suck it up. And I am here to say that that is not the assumption. In fact, our assumption actually needs to be that if we are doing that important work, we actually need to really, really, really make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and others in the way we structure our workplaces and we structure the work and we respond to one another and we care for ourselves and one another. And so that awareness that I talked about in the beginning. She also notes that sometimes we get into our own world so much and we're working so much or we're thinking about work so much that we start to assume that everybody is seeing the world in the same way we are. And sometimes it's refreshing to realize that people aren't, but sometimes it's really annoying too. And we're kind of like impatient with people who seem not to recognize the seriousness of what people experience in this world and the kind of work that we and others do and need to do because of, you know, injustices and big systemic and structural challenges in this world. She also speaks to the fact that, you know, sometimes it's hard to turn it off, right? Are we ever not working, right? Even on vacation, she's doing this triage that is so connected to the work that she does at this tertiary emergency care center, Harborview Hospital in Seattle. But she also reminds us that that one of the reasons that she got to this point, and many of us get to this point, is because this is a very gradual, insidious creep, and we're not always aware of it. And so part of what we want to do is to start to be more aware of ourselves and one another, and to give ourselves permission to name it for ourselves and to name it for others. And so I see Katie's comment. Oh, I think it only went to hosts and panelists, but she was saying that she loves this TED Talk, and the whole TED Talk is great. And I encourage you to see it. And if you have a copy of the slides, there's a link in there, but you can just Google it with this title as well. And so, you know, we really do need to start to pay attention and think about this for ourselves and for one another. Hang on, let me move the slide now. All right. So I keep talking about this idea of secondary traumatic stress, or STS. So here are some of the common things that we see that may be indicators of secondary traumatic stress. And I want to point out, this is not a diagnosis, right? This is a kind of concept, a framework for us to understand what can happen to us as providers. But we can see avoidance, as I mentioned. And one of the other ways that we see avoidance is things like tardiness and incomplete work, or not engaging in things. Somebody who used to volunteer for stuff and now doesn't. Intrusions, as I mentioned. Lots of anxiety about our own well-being or the well-being of those who we care about is sometimes a form of intrusion. We may also see a lot of physical symptoms. And this is where sometimes we assume that our physical symptoms are related to burnout and overwork, but they may actually be related to the fact that we're dealing with a lot of trauma in our work as well. So you can see the array of physical symptoms that we may experience. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means. Changes in our thinking, cognitive changes that we're more negative or cynical, but also that we're having more trouble making decisions, or we are not feeling as creative. We're having difficulty focusing, or we're just kind of losing interest. We're getting apathetic in that way. Emotional changes. Again, this often we experience this and we immediately assume it's related to a quantity issue, that the work, we have too much work to do, but sometimes it's about the quality of the work too, the kind of work that we're doing. And it can range from depression and sadness to also being anxiety with exaggerated feels or feelings of guilt, or that we're not doing enough, or that there's not enough we can do, or that we can't change certain big systems, or feeling very isolated and alone, a sense of numbness, or being angry at the world. So any of those could be related to this. And then lots of social changes and changes in our interpersonal relationships. And again, it could range from being more withdrawn to having no interest or not being able to have any fun in things, to irritability, etc. We also know from the research that this slide says educator, but it's actually true for everybody. So I will fix that. But we know that there are some risk factors for secondary traumatic stress. So the first thing is our dose exposure. The more exposure we have, the more at risk we are. So if you are a trauma therapist, for example, or if you work in an emergency room, or if 100% of your caseload has experienced trauma, like people who work in the child welfare system, then you are at greater risk. But we all probably have some degree of risk. And so we want to be thinking about how much of our workday is spent engaging with the potential for trauma in the people who we're helping or in the way that we are required to do the work. If we have a personal history of trauma, there's actually some conflicting evidence about this. It seems to come down on to the idea that just having a personal history of trauma doesn't necessarily increase your risk if you have processed that trauma and feel like you have some resolution to it or have demonstrated some resilience through it. But if it's trauma that still feels like it's unresolved, and you haven't had the time or the perspective to be able to think that through, that may increase your risk. Another way that our risk is increased, and this is something that we really can do something about, is around our competence. When we don't feel like we're prepared or well trained to do our job, that can increase our risk because we feel less sure about how to respond. And so that seems to load in. We do see higher rates of secondary trauma among new people who are new to their field. But we also see that, and in contrast, we see less burnout when you're new to the field, maybe higher risk of secondary trauma. But as you stay in the field longer, your risk for secondary trauma goes down. Now, that may be because people who have had really strong secondary traumatic stress responses actually leave the field, but it may also be that we develop strategies to be able to manage it. And what I'm suggesting is if we can pay attention, we don't have to wait to develop those strategies over time. We can actually start to implement them right at the start of our careers. We do seem to see that people with high degrees of emotional intelligence and who are highly empathic are at greater risk. And that's kind of funny, I always think, because probably those are also the same kinds of people who go into this work. So it's part and parcel. And then statistically from the research, we do see that there are higher rates of secondary trauma among female workers, but we also know that that may be a bit of a construct about how we have been socialized to respond to what we feel and think and how we explain to ourselves what we're experiencing. And there's a little bit of gendered way that we have been taught that. And so it'll be interesting to see over time if that holds up. And we also know that the Health and Human Services and education are all slightly more female dominant professions than maybe some others. All right, but we also know that organizations can create risks for us. And the way that organizations do that is by the kind of work that they give us, how well they train us, how they structure things like case reviews and going over the work, so which can either enhance or reduce the potential for exposure to more trauma. The way that we have supervision and support, and whether there is this kind of implicit culture of sucking it up. So one of the things that, I've certainly seen in my experience and in my research is the differences between, say, law enforcement and maybe therapists' approaches to even being open to learning about this and understanding it, right? And so one of the things that we all learned after the events of September 11th over 20 years ago is that first responders had a really hard time acknowledging the impact of the trauma, even folks who weren't at the site as a primary trauma, but who then went and helped later and experienced a lot of secondary trauma in helping the helpers, that this was very, very hard. And so we're really understanding this more, and we recognize that this is not a matter of saying to individual staff, oh, you need to take better care of yourself. This is about how we do things as an organization, as an agency, as a branch or a division or a team to help promote the things that we think are going to be helpful. All right, so I just want you to ask yourselves kind of, like, how does this sit with you? Do you know other folks who you think have experienced some of these stressors, who have experienced compassion fatigue or burnout or secondary traumatic stress? Have you ever experienced one of these? Does it seem worse in the last few years? If you want to drop things into the chat, I'm always eager to see your responses. Is this resonating with people? Yes, well, we see a yes. So something in it is resonating. Okay, definitely. Okay. All right. So keep those coming. Yes. All right. So people are seeing some things. All right, good. So let's talk now. Oh, I got two more things. There are two more elements that we haven't given enough attention to in the past. So I just want to elevate them. The first is this idea of moral injury or moral distress. Moral injury and moral distress are two ways of thinking that are very similar. Moral injury comes from the world of veterans, actually. This is from work and research that the VA was doing. Moral distress has come out of the healthcare field, starting with nurses. But what they refer to is that sometimes in our job, we are asked to do things that don't square with our core values, maybe just for that moment or maybe in a bigger way. So an example of this from the nursing world would be that nurses are trained to make people feel better, to help people to feel better. But sometimes in order to do that, they have to do things that actually in the short term make them feel worse. So a lot of this work came out of the oncology world and people who were working with people with terminal illness who were saying, as nurses, I feel like I'm creating more harm than help. It's just hard for me, even though I know that this is intended to help for the long term. It's really hard for me to administer this treatment, this medicine, do this procedure when I know it hurts people in the short term, and that is taking a toll on me. The moral injury side was, as you can imagine, that we often ask people who are in our defense forces to do things that run counter to what we have all been taught, which is, don't harm other people, thou shalt not kill, things like that. And so people were coming back with a lot of distress, and it took a while for folks to sort out, oh, this isn't just post-traumatic stress disorder, there's something else going on here. And what happens when we experience that dissonance, that incongruence between our core sense of self and what we're being asked to do, is we start to get distressed, and we can experience shame or guilt. We feel a sense of betrayal by the people who we are trusting to guide us and lead us. We may have doubts in ourselves or doubts in our profession. We can even get to the point of feeling desperate or hopeless, and often have a sense of powerlessness. And we know that powerlessness is one of the features of the experience of experiencing something as a trauma. And so obviously you can see how this could impact us in our personal or professional lives. I want to point out that this is not a disorder. This is part of being human. This is how we react as humans when we feel this dissonance. And some of it may be avoidable and some of it may not be avoidable, but it's just something to be aware of. And what we've started to understand is that this is a place where we have to acknowledge and talk through what we're experiencing and what we're feeling and where and why we sense that dissonance. And this is an important element for supervision, for example, and even for talking with colleagues. which many of us do spontaneously. But what we're suggesting is now that we understand it more, we probably need to build it into our ways of doing things as an organization. And so this does get to this idea of shared humanity, that if we are humans and being human is part of what enables us to do this work, it also makes us vulnerable. And we have to recognize that and use that shared humanity to build our resilience. The last area that I want to just give a nod to is one that you're all familiar with, because there's no way that we don't experience this. And we certainly have witnessed and experienced it more in the last few years, but this idea of grief and loss. And grief and loss, even if it is part and parcel of the work we do, it affects us, and we can't pretend that it doesn't. And so, like other things, we know that grief waxes and wanes. We also know that it's natural. We know that past experiences of grief and loss can be activated by the present. And so sometimes we can be caught short by things. And we know that we've had a lot of experiences of grief over the last few years as a result of this pandemic. And then also in other kinds of ways. And here in Kentucky, certainly like the tornadoes, the flooding, then all of these natural disasters. And then when we think about our country and our racial reckoning that we're going through, these are all can elicit strong feelings of grief and loss. So when I talk about grief and loss, I'm not just talking about the literal losses, but also the figurative and spiritual losses that we may experience in different ways in work. And we know that sometimes this can be acute, and we, have a broken branch, so to speak, and then the branch gets cut down or falls off and the tree continues to grow, and you wouldn't really notice unless you looked hard. But sometimes when we're exposed to grief and loss over time, it becomes more chronic and impacts us more strongly. And it's important to think about that in terms of the kind of work that you do and how grief and loss may be a part of that. All right, so now I want us to get to what can we do? So the good news is that there are some things that we can do. The bad news is that we have to make some time and be intentional. So we have to create some cognitive space to recognize and do these things. So some of it is basics. And some of it is stuff that you've heard before. These are the same kinds of things that your grandma told you, that your doctor tells you, that a concerned friend or colleague may tell you. So the first thing is to recognize what's going on, to start to pay attention and acknowledge it, and not just like push it away and say, oh, I'll deal with that later. I'm too busy now, I'll deal with that later. Because what we know is that the accumulation of this exposure and the not dealing with it does not make it get better. It only makes it get worse. And as I mentioned earlier, taking care of our body and mind is really important. We've also discovered how important things like routines and staying connected are, and being pro-social. And what I mean by that is doing good for others, but in ways that may be different from our work, maybe different from the way that we normally help people, things that can give us like an immediate sense of effectiveness and efficacy, and that we did something. So, volunteering at a food pantry where you actually get to see, oh, food comes in, food goes out, I immediately help something. Working on a Habitat for Humanity house where you actually literally can step back at the end of the day and see what you did that day. That's very different sometimes from the work that we're doing, where we don't always see the impact, or it takes a long time. So, the basics of taking care of your body. I'm not going to spend time on this. If you've never seen this TED Talk by Matt Walker and you're interested in how sleep matters, I encourage you to watch it, but I give you the fair warning that you will never see sleep in the same way again, because it turns out sleep is super, super important. What I want to say about all three of these is we're not talking about, being able to run the marathon in a year from now. We're talking about just getting some regular but small amounts of exercise can still be helpful. And so, healthy food doesn't mean that you never let sugar cross your lips again. It means that the majority of the time you try to make sure you have the nutrients that you need, etc. So being reasonable, like we don't want to create more stress for ourselves by trying to mitigate our stress, right? So being reasonable, having compassion for yourselves in these ways matters. All right. One way that I want us to pay attention to our bodies is we're just going to do a body scan right right now. Body scans help you get connected to your body. And they help you identify where you're feeling the stress and where you might need to focus on doing something about it. All right, so what I want you to do is get comfortable in your chair. You can either look at this very relaxed cub on the rock, or you can close your eyes or find something else that's a good focal point for you. I want you to start to slow your breathing down, making sure that you're breathing out as well as in. So just getting into a rhythm and trying to breathe deeply to the bottom of your lungs, really pushing out your diaphragm, which often feels like you're breathing to your belly. And I want you to start with your toes and start to pay attention by wiggling or focusing on different parts of your body. So your toes and your feet, noticing what you feel. Is there any discomfort or pain? Moving up your legs. Now into your hips, your belly, and your back. Many of us experience a lot of lower back and upper back tension, discomfort, and pain. And as you're checking in, move your body. See if you can find a way to be a little more comfortable. If you notice something that doesn't feel comfortable, you're noticing any pain. And as you go through your torso, noticing your chest, your stomach. I think I said your stomach, but if I forgot that, very important. And then as you get to your shoulders, notice your arms and your shoulders and your elbows, and your wrists and your hands and your fingers, those joints in your fingers from typing all day long, or your wrists from moving that mouse around. Notice the difference between your dominant side and your less dominant side, the side that you sit towards. Maybe shift in your chair. If you cross your legs in the same way every day, flip it around. Try crossing them in the other direction. Now, as you're breathing, I want you to focus on your neck and on your throat. Opening up your throat, noticing if your jaw feels tight. Now noticing how your jaw and your chin, your ears, your eyes, the top of your head, your scalp, the back of your head, your neck, all of that, just checking in. And remember what you've noticed from this check-in. Where are some places that you need to pay attention to? And when you have some time, think about what you can do to address those areas of discomfort. Sometimes it may just be changing a position or breathing to that area or doing a squeeze release kind of exercise to release the tension. But very often we go through our days and we go through our lives without checking in with our own bodies. And it's helpful just to take a few seconds every now and then. Doesn't even have to be every day, but it's a nice habit to do every day if you can. Just to check in and see, how are you, body? What do you need from me? What can I do for you? And hopefully we can get to the place where we can let go enough to be as relaxed as this cub on this warm rock. And to feel that sense of letting our muscles go and kind of being like jelly for a little bit of time, without carrying the stress of everything that we do personally as well as professionally in our bodies. All right, I invite you now to take a deep breath and come back. We're going to continue with our presentation. So that's a nice transition into taking care of your mind. And there's lots and lots of resources out there. But as I said earlier, the research tells us that positive thinking, positive psychology, having hope, mindfulness, and having gratitude actually can help us. They actually can help us to be more resilient. This idea of practicing gratitude, I think for a long time, a lot of us thought, yeah, it sounds nice and it might work for some people, but it actually turns out that there's some real science behind it, that taking time to recognize what you can be grateful for in your own life shifts your brain functioning. It helps you, and it makes it easier to combat the regular stressors. So these strategies don't take away the stress. What they're doing is they're building up neural pathways and ways of being that can help you manage those stressors. And I think that's a really important difference, because sometimes people say to us, well, yeah, it's one thing to have gratitude, but I still have all this other stuff on my plate. And now what we understand from the science, from the evidence is yes. And the gratitude will make it easier for you to manage that big plate. Maybe it makes the plate bigger so it can hold more. Maybe it makes it stronger. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but it's very interesting to me because I am lousy at gratitude. Like officially, I don't do well with like keeping a gratitude journal or writing it down every day. Although I think that I am pretty optimistic, and I think I'm pretty willing to acknowledge what's going well in my life. I have a hard time naming it, but it turns out that naming it can make a big difference. So, I share that with you. My email's at the end of this presentation if you have specific questions about this. But, so things like thinking positively, that person who always is able to think more positively and sometimes gets on your nerves, you don't have to become like them, but you might channel a little bit of them into your way of thinking about things in that way. One of the reasons that all of this is so helpful is because it helps us to manage our baseline of stress. Okay. So what I just said is that, if we are less stressed, then we look like the diagram on the left. And we have a long way to go to our breaking point. But when we are carrying more stress, our breaking point is a little bit closer. Right. And so it doesn't take as much to get us over that tipping point. And so these strategies that help us to not get up to that tipping point so quickly are really, really, really helpful. And so just an image for you to keep in your mind. What we also understand is that this can help us expand our window of tolerance, that sometimes when we've experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of adversity and stress in our lives, what happens is the amount that we can tolerate gets to be like a rigid amount. It's not very flexible. And remember at the beginning, I said that flexibility and adaptation is one of the characteristics of being able to be resilient. And so these strategies can help us keep our window of tolerance more flexible so that we aren't as easily put into that hyper aroused, anxious, agitated state, or we don't as easily shut down, depending on which way we tend to go, into that depressed or apathetic or negative place at the lower level. So just that's how those strategies can be very helpful to us. I want to talk just a little bit about mindfulness, because again, mindfulness is like really out there, and every magazine you pick up or every podcast you listen to has something to say about mindfulness. And some of it is really good and some of it is maybe less good. But part of what we want to remember about mindfulness is that it's not tuning out, it's actually tuning in. It's awareness. It's being connected to yourself and to your body in a way that is not full of judgment, that is accepting of, okay, this is where I am now. That's okay. I'm going to work with this, as opposed to saying to ourselves, oh, I should have, or I could have, or I need to, etc. So it is a very, very empowering and also relieving practice, because we stop fighting against ourselves and the world in certain ways. And it doesn't mean that we necessarily give in. It means that we have a realistic place to start. And so it helps us to be more effective in how we want to approach ourselves and our current stress and situation. This does come from the science of self-regulation. What we know about mindfulness is that it works against that stress response that was described in the movie, which is really our sympathetic nervous system response that is activated by our alarm response and sends us into fight, flight, or freeze with that cortisol flood into our body. And that is a physiological response. Now, normally when we are rid of the threat, when we're away from the threat, our parasympathetic nervous system would kick into action. However, sometimes when we're experiencing chronic threat or stress, our parasympathetic nervous system gets tired or it just doesn't kick in. And the good news is that it turns out that mindfulness practices can externally trigger that parasympathetic nervous system into action. It can activate it, even if it doesn't activate itself naturally. And so it helps to get us back into that state of being more regulated. It may not get us back to like a perfectly balanced, regulated state, but it takes us out of that super aroused place. And so that's how mindfulness can be so helpful. So there are tons of different ways that we can practice mindfulness, and everybody needs to find their own. What I want to say to you is that what is important about mindfulness is that it becomes a practice, a part of our daily life, or our mostly daily life, right? So, if it doesn't happen every single day, that's fine, but to shoot for maybe 4 to 5 times a week. The good news is that you don't need a lot of time. So the research tells us that probably 15 to 20 minutes is the ideal amount, but we see benefit from even less. So when you are first starting to integrate these into your life, start really small. Start with 1 to 3 minutes, 3 times a week, and find a place where you can carve that out of your day. Maybe it's when you get in the car and before you drive home, now that many of us are back to working in offices at least part of the time. Maybe it's when you first wake up. Maybe it's when you go back to bed, when you go to bed at night. Maybe it's when you're brushing your teeth or after you brush your teeth. There are lots of different ways you can integrate this. And so I just urge you to give this some thought and think about how this can work for you. If you have kids at home, especially if your kids have experienced some stress in these last few years, this is a lovely thing to do with them and to help teach them. The earlier they learn how to do this, the easier it will be for them when they're adults. But it also, we tend to do things a little bit better when we're modeling it for our kids. Great thing to do with a partner or with a friend. Here's one way that you can also do another body scan. And so I just share this with you that you can use for yourselves or for others. Holly, I love the fact that you start a parenting class. So here's what the research tells us about it for educators, is that teachers who use mindfulness in their classrooms like their jobs better and have lower self-reported stress levels. So when you teach it and you use it with others, you benefit from it yourself. So you're probably getting some benefit at the start of those parenting classes also. So that's great. All right, so here's just another tool for you for your toolbox. Let's do this grounding moment. So grounding is this idea that sometimes we need to come back into the present. We are riddled with things where we're thinking about what's happened in the past, either the far past or the near past, or what's happening in the far or near future. And so we often are really, really full. Our brains are full of all of this stuff that is everything but the here and now and the right now. And if we experience trauma reminders, or if we are working with people who experience trauma reminders, one of the first things we want to do is we want to get out of that place that we have gone to, that where we're remembering a past trauma, and we want to refocus on the present. But sometimes that's easier said than done. This is a 5-sensory grounding activity that's pretty simple to do. It works for people of all ages, and you do it in your mind's eye. So I'm going to ask everybody to take a deep breath in. And in the space around you, in your mind's eye, I want you to name off to yourself 5 things that you see. Can be just anything that's in your environment. Just name off 5 in your mind's eye. And I always have to use my fingers to tick off that I'm doing 5. And now I want you to focus on what you hear. So that could be things within your body or outside of your body, and identify 4 things that you hear. And now I want to focus on your body itself, both how it feels internally or how it feels kind of externally in terms of temperature or what's on your skin, or, you know, kind of where you are located in space, and identify 3 things that you feel either internally or, you know, in terms of your body in space. And now 2 things you smell. And 1 thing you taste. Now take a deep breath in and out. So that takes less than 20 seconds. It's a really nice way when you are feeling frazzled, or if you've just had a hot encounter with somebody and you just kind of need to slow down and get it together. It's a really nice way to refocus, to ground yourself, to reconnect to your body, and to refocus your mind so that you can start to then think a little more clearly. None of us think clearly when we're hot, right? And so we need to cool down, calm down, re-regulate. And so that's a nice strategy to do that. Here's ways that you can incorporate mindfulness and reflection into work. So this is not just things that you need to do on your own, but some of it are things that you can do. But as Holly said, starting a parenting class or any kind of group meeting with a mindfulness few minutes or few seconds is a lovely way to start or end. Doing what we call in the cabinet celebration and critique round robins at the end of a meeting, which gives everybody a chance to reflect and to celebrate something that happened in that meeting, or to give some constructive criticism, is a really useful way of wrapping things up. It gives everybody a little bit of transition time, but also brings some closure to that meeting. So there's not a lot hanging out there, which when we're carrying a lot of loose threads, they can actually weigh us down. They become more than just threads. It's like they start to become chains. Beginning and end of day, and I don't mean the end of day of your actual day, like yourself when you're waking up and going, but even at your work day. So like starting your day with an intention and saying, okay, here are the things that I intend to do today. And then maybe ending your day with, okay, this is what went well. This is where I need to work on things tomorrow. Here's what I can check off, etc., is a nice way to bookend and also have some reflection and some mindfulness about your job and your role. And then finding opportunities where together we can do things like mindfulness or even yoga or things. Lots of organizations have adopted using texting and other forms of social media, whatever works, Slack or Teams or whatever, to send reminders to people. You can even put signs up in your workplace that remind people to breathe or to stretch or to move or to notice or to check in with their bodies, etc. So these are ways that we can incorporate this into our work days. So several times I've mentioned the power of connection and communication, and it really is powerful. If any of you have read Bruce Perry and Oprah's book on called What Happened to You, Bruce Perry is kind of the person who for years and years and years has been promoting this idea for that relationships are at the crux of healing from trauma. And I think he's right. And what we know is that relationships build resilience. And one of the ways that we can do this in our workplaces is to have work buddies. And work buddies are really important, and they're different from buddies outside of work because our work buddies understand what we're living with, what we're going through, right? They know the personalities involved, they know the stresses of the work, etc. And so having a work buddy is having one person at work that you check in with regularly and they check in with you. It has to be somebody who you trust and respect and probably like. That's probably an important thing. So we're not suggesting that you get assigned work buddies, right? This is somebody who you choose. And this is a way that you can process and metabolize things that are happening. And I'm going to teach you a low impact approach in just a minute. But this is a way that you can be listened and heard and seen. You can have your thoughts and your feelings validated. And it also reminds us that having these thoughts and feelings about the work is normal, but it's not for necessarily finding a solution. It's just for metabolizing. Oh my gosh, I had this situation today and it made me feel so powerless that I couldn't fix it, or so frustrated with the system, or I'm so pissed off that this person was 3 points over the cutoff point and they're not going to be eligible for this service or this public assistance or whatever it is. And we have those feelings and we sometimes just need to get them out. And so this is a trusted and safe place to do that. It also can be a way that we can have some accountability when we're working on taking care of ourselves or taking care of our minds in a certain way, where somebody can say, hey, did you do your mindful? How many times did you do mindfulness this week? Or how many times did you do this week? Or let's do it together, etc. So there are several ways that you can use this buddy system. But interestingly, the research is that this is actually a very effective work intervention. I mentioned grief earlier, and connection and communication are a part of how we address grief in the workplace. And so I did give you a few, and you can look at this on your own, but we don't want to let grief just slide by unacknowledged. And we also want to be very respectful if we're dealing with a grief experienced by somebody in our workplace, or a grief that we've experienced collectively in the workplace. We have to recognize that everybody responds differently. And so here are some suggestions for how we can be flexible, how we can be a little bit more specific, not put the onus on the person to direct us to what would be helpful or how they need help, but to make some offers, and to always make sure that we know about our employee assistance program for ourselves and our colleagues. And here are some don'ts for when we're addressing grief in the workplace. One of the things that we find is that sharing our own grief experiences actually doesn't make it that much better for other folks. And so that seems counter sometimes, but I think workplace expressions of grief are a little bit different from personal, and sometimes personal, that doesn't help either, but sometimes it's tolerated a little bit better. And to remember that there's no specific timeline. And, if you have the unfortunate experience of losing a member of your team, somebody in your workplace, this ramps all of this up to, we have to address this, we have to pay attention. And so we have to create that space for processing, for honoring not only the person, but our feelings about this loss. And for recognizing that this is a significant loss for everybody who interacted with that person. And, even just the idea of taking on that person's responsibilities can in and of themselves become a bit of a trauma reminder. So being cognizant of that and making sure that we're attending to that in a way. So I mentioned this idea of low impact debriefing, or what I like to call low impact processing. Very often when we're experiencing a lot of stress in our workplace and we're quote unquote very hot and activated, we tend to go find somebody who we trust or the person who's closest to us, and we say to them, oh my gosh, you won't believe what just happened. And we slime them with the details. We tell them what we just read or heard or saw. And what it turns out that when we do that, we are not only then exposing them to additional trauma, which they hadn't been exposed to before, but we're actually re-traumatizing ourselves because we're re-exposing ourselves to the trauma. So when we metabolize trauma, what we actually need to do is we need to process its effects on us. We need to process how it is making us feel and what it's making us think, not the actual details of the trauma. And as I said, by just repeating those details, we're not only re-traumatizing ourselves and others, but we may actually be making then that effect worse, right? We're making things worse for ourselves. So this is a 4-step process that was developed by the TEND Academy in Canada. And it can be used for both individual processing, but it also can be used when you have case reviews in a group where you have to share a little bit about what happened to the families that you're working with, but you want to be cognizant that you only want to share the bare minimum, what's necessary for people to understand. All right, so what are the four steps? Well, the first step is to recognize that this is something traumatic that you need to talk about, either because you need to process your feelings and thoughts, or because it's required that you share something about it in this, work setting, this case review, or this meeting, or whatever is happening at work. So paying attention and knowing, oh, this could be a trauma, or this was a trauma for me. And then giving fair warning. So if you are, excuse me, I'm just about to sneeze. Sorry. Oh, maybe not. If you are one-on-one with somebody and you need to metabolize what just happened, instead of bursting into their office or calling them and saying, oh my gosh, you won't believe what just happened, blah, you say, wow, I just had a really tough situation and I need to process it. Are you available? So you've given them warning that you need to process something big. And now you've also done number 3, which is that you're asking, or you've started to do number 3, which is that you're asking for their consent to go ahead and share. Do they have capacity? Because what if they've just had something terrible happen? Or what if they're just in a bad way? They're having a hard time that day and their plate is full. And so by asking, we're actually giving people permission to say, you know what, I'm really full up right now, or I've got to go in and do something really difficult. I don't have time, or I'm afraid if I listen to you, I'm not going to be able to do the next thing on my plate, etc. And it doesn't mean that they don't care about us as people. It means that they are self-aware and they know what they need in that moment. In a group setting, fair warning and consent looks a little bit different. So what you're going to do is you're going to say to the group, listen, I've got to review this case now, and I need to let you all know that there's some trauma here. And so I'm only going to share the bare minimum of details. For example, it might be that you say there was child abuse. This is the type of child abuse it was, and this is who the perpetrator was for this child. And you don't get into a lot of details in this group setting. There may be some people who, because of their work, need to know the details, but you're very careful about need to know basis. And by warning people, you're also kind of saying to them, if this is too much for you right now, feel free to space out, turn off your camera, step away, go out of the room for a little while, whatever they need to do to take care of themselves. So this is, in that setting, you want to have a kind of group understanding that that's allowed. And then, as I said, number 4 is this limited disclosure. So it's what do the people need to know to review the case? And on an individual basis, it probably is, you don't have to give very many details at all. You just have to say, you know what? This person just shared with me this horrible experience they had during childhood, and it makes me feel angry, ashamed, furious, powerless, depressed, like giving up, whatever, it makes me feel or think this way. And that's what you process, because that's where we need the help, because it's the feelings and the thoughts that are actually making us feel bad and causing us to experience what then can turn into compassion fatigue or symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. So I hope I explained that well. Lee dropped the handout in the chat, and you'll get that when you get, or I don't know how they're sending things out, but anyway, there it is. So a great resource for you. Another thing that I mentioned was that along with this idea of being self-aware, we want to be not only aware of ourselves, but aware of others. Oops, the PowerPoint just shut down. Did that just happen? Yes, it did.
It did.
Hang on for 1 second. I'm going to stop sharing. And I don't know what happened. That's so weird. It just went away. I wonder if my computer is having issues. I shouldn't
We
even.
can see your home screen, Miriam.
Yep, I know. So that's my preview from my house in Massachusetts. I'm about to reshare, pause share, stop share. I'm so sorry. We are almost finished though. All right, hang on just for 1 second. Let me make sure that I get this up. I've never had that happen. Let me get to the slide that we were at. From slide. All right, so let me share with you all. All right. Oh my gosh. So let's see if you see. This is so weird. Okay, are you seeing the home screen or are you seeing the slide?
Slides. It's
Perfect.
back.
Awareness and monitoring.
Yes.
Okay, so these are some resources that can help you do some self-assessment or some assessment if you're a supervisor of staff. We don't recommend that you require people to do this. These are tools that people can and should have access to. They are all available at the UK Well at Work website. And so that is linked at the end of the slides. But one of the things that we, suggest is that as part of paying attention, we should start to know where we are and to have the tools to understand where we are and to use this as part of our supervision, so that we're not only talking about what is the work that you're doing and how much of it are you doing and how well are you doing it, but how is it impacting you? Now, this comes more naturally to some supervisors than to others, and it feels more comfortable to some supervisees than to others. So you have to gauge that and build that in. But I wanted you to have some tools to be able to use for that. So let me try and advance the slide and hopefully it won't shut down. All right. All of this comes from some research, and there's additional research, but this was a pretty seminal article that really talked about what are the protective factors for us in work settings. And so you can see that things like mentoring, work boundaries, self-care, social emotional support, which we've talked about in different ways, but this really can happen in the context of our peer supervision, our care for one another, as well as our supervision with our supervisors. Is an important thing. I want to focus our remaining time on this idea of sense of satisfaction. Because one of the things that we know is that even though there are some inherent risks in the work that we do, we choose to do this work, and many of us stay in it, right? I've been here for 30 plus years, and lots of other people have been here for a really long time. And what we've come to understand is the reason that we stay is because we love what we do, or we at least like it, and it gives us a sense of satisfaction. And we've named that compassion satisfaction. And what we know is that we can tolerate a certain amount of compassion fatigue and even secondary trauma if we have an equal or greater amount of compassion satisfaction. Now, I say equal or greater, and it's really hard to measure this. So this is soft assessments of quantity in that way. So what do I mean by compassion satisfaction? Well, what I mean is this idea of the good stuff, the pleasure and the satisfaction of helping people. And we get it from knowing that we're doing something that people need, that we're creating systems that work, that we enjoy working with our colleagues and we value them and they value us, that back to that sense of meaning, that we're passing something forward, and that somehow we recognize that this is kind of what we were meant to do or supposed to do, or we feel good about doing it. So how can we build that compassion satisfaction? Well, this stuff is actually pretty simple, but it has to become more intentional, because we often don't do it as much as we can or should. So the first thing is to promote the good. And so that we do this in lots of ways. We use strengths-based frameworks. We honor lessons learned. We use affirmations both for the people who we're working with and for each other and ourselves. And we don't just affirm our outcomes, but also our process. That when we know that we have worked hard on in a situation, even if it didn't turn out exactly as we want it, that's worth affirming. That we do celebrate successes, and that we really remember our inspiration and our motivation, right? That's a terrific counter to that burnout, that is that lack of inspiration and loss of inspiration and lack of motivation in that way. So again, these are not things that require special training, right? These are things that we know how to do. And so part of what we need to do is to be more intentional about doing them. So if you are a supervisor, I challenge you to think about how you can build this in to the way that you run your team and you work with the folks who you supervise. Lots of ways that you can celebrate success: giving kudos, recognizing achievements, starting or ending meetings with good news. And that could be personal or professional, right? That's good news is kind of contagious. As I said, recognizing process and effort as much as outcome, and remembering what our inspiration is. So, hang on for 1 second. Let's see. I'm going to do this one first and then go back. So one of the ways that sometimes what happens is, as the longer that we're doing work, is we actually forget our why. And a really nice exercise to do, either as an exercise for supervision or even an exercise, and people don't have to share this, they just do it for themselves, that you do like in a staff retreat, is to remember your inspiration. And it's pretty simple. It's just that, like, what's your why for doing this? And then to think about, what's a situation that reminds you of your why in the work that you do today, this week, this month, right now. And then also, who can you share your inspiration with, who you think would understand it and recognize it and value it in the same way that you do. So I challenge you all to take some time over the next few weeks to really ask yourself, what is your why? And I will say that writing it down is a really good exercise. It forces you to think it through and to really come up with some of the words for your why, because very often it's just kind of a feeling or an impulse. And it's something that I try to do pretty regularly, because I think that it helps to ground me and it reminds me, and it also helps me to let go of some of the stuff that isn't as important in that way. Many of you may know Commissioner Miranda Straub, and Commissioner Miranda Straub has this wonderful way that she likes to remind herself of what's good in her day-to-day work. And she calls it her spiritual candy bar. And she tries to find a spiritual candy bar every single day, and she challenges the rest of us to do it. And a spiritual candy bar could be a meeting, a person, or an experience that feeds your heart and soul, and that validates your values, your work, and your connections. So I challenge you all to find that spiritual candy bar for yourself for today, and to start to ask yourself every day, oh, what's my spiritual candy bar today? And to say it out loud. It's really fun to say to somebody, oh, you're going to be my spiritual candy bar today. You're going to be that thing that feeds me, that I kind of remember today, this good thing happened in that way. All right. I also shared with you, and I think Lee can drop this in the chat, an exercise that you can do called the self-care wheel. And there are some instructions for it. So this looks at all of these domains of how you are caring for yourself. And then it asks you to rate what you've put in each domain. So to get at least one thing in each pie piece, and then to rate them about how helpful or useful they are. And then to be really honest with yourself and say, you know what? If you don't use it or it's not helpful, even if other people think it's a good thing to do, don't do it anymore. Find the things that actually help you. So it's just a way of making sure that if you are engaging in self-care, which I hope that you find some ways to do, that you're doing it in ways that actually are beneficial for you and you're not wasting your time on things that don't work for you. Here's another way that you can think about self-care that's nourishing, and look at the different domains. So you'll see that on the slide, and you can, create a little table for yourselves about how you want to think about that. But the link to this is at the bottom. So these are all tools that are out there for you. I want to end just with a word about self-compassion, because I started with that at the beginning when we were talking about this idea of compassion fatigue. And we know that self-compassion is really, really important if we're going to sustain and be able to do this work. And what we understand about self-compassion from the work of Kristen Neff is that it's not that complicated, but it does require intentionality. That what we have to do is engage in self-kindness, positive ways of talking to ourselves and thinking. That we have to recognize our common humanity and understand that we are just like those other people in our lives who we offer grace and compassion for, and we want to offer that to ourselves. And that we also want to be aware of when we're suffering and not be afraid to ask for help. And that these three elements of self-compassion are really important. And so I believe at the end that there's a link to Kristen Neff's website. So I'll leave you with some words from Brene Brown, and some of her work is complicated, but I do think that this quote is very helpful, is that we don't have to do all of it alone. We were never meant to. We are social creatures, and we are here to help one another. And within our organizations, we need to be aware of that as well. So I hope that you'll find one thing that you can put into action quickly, like that you can use tomorrow, at least one thing that you want to learn more about. And I want you to be honest with yourself and find one thing that worries you about being more trauma-informed and resilience-oriented in your work for yourself as a worker or for your colleagues, and then start to think about, what do I want to do about that? I gave you some resilience resources here. Yes, the self-compassion one is the last one there. And then invite you to reach out to me if you need to. So I'm going to stop sharing and say thanks. Oops, let's see if I can stop sharing. There we go. Say thanks, everybody.
And we want to say thank you to you. You're getting lots of kudos in the chat, and a lot of people looking forward to watching the recording and sharing it with their staff.
And so I see a few questions that were answered, and it looks like some of that was more technical stuff. And Melissa, thank you for the share about how this is used in horses. So great to know. Yeah, we are creatures, right? Just like lots of other creatures. So thanks for whatever technology little blips we had. I appreciate everybody's patience. And go forth. And I know that you do really important, beautiful work. And I also want to encourage you to care for yourselves and care for one another so that we can continue to do this work together and be part of this system of care. We are a system, and it's a beautiful system, and I want to keep it going. I know you do too.